I'm David Speers. Welcome to Insiders. The main target of new spending in this week's budget was the poorest in society. Those struggling on unemployment benefits or finding it impossible to pay the rent or visit the doctor. Labor says there are some measures too that will help middle Australia, and with the stage 3 tax cuts remaining in place, it's trying to keep faith with those at the top as well. All this, and a surplus to boot, made it a hard budget for the coalition to attack. Liberals certainly tried, calling it inflationary and divisive. They want to blame the government for any further rises in interest rates. But by the end of the week, it was clear there's little in this budget Peter Dutton will oppose. You'll hear from the Treasurer a little later in the program. He joins us live from Brisbane. But first, the panel, Shane Wright, Jennifer Hewett and Andrew Probyn. Very happy Mother's Day. Jennifer, thank you for joining us on a Mother's Day, and to my mum, all the mums out there, very happy Mother's Day. Let's get into the budget though. Shane, what was the aim, do you think, of this budget? What was the Treasurer trying to achieve?
Like, he was trying to walk a really thin piece of fabric over a very large gaping hole. He's got an economy that is slowing. Like, he is forecasting about 1.5% growth over the next 12 months. Historically, you're in the bottom 5 or 6 of the last 40, 50 years. That's the big slowdown, and inflation is the key part. So he's trying to balance, how do I support the economy without adding to inflation, which is running at 7%, it's supposed to fall. You've got the pressures around, particularly around energy, where all the increases in energy prices are feeding a lot into the overall inflation picture. So he's had to try to balance that, and that's where he's got to this week. And
how's he gone, do you think, Jennifer, in striking that balance?
Well, I think, of course, the balance was helped greatly by the fact that he had surging revenue, thanks to higher commodity prices, higher taxes, including corporate taxes, and also some assistance from immigration numbers, which has other problems.
And a stronger jobs market.
And a very strong jobs market. Yeah, so all of that really helped him. But he clearly also didn't want to risk doing too much that would fuel inflation, be accused of doing that. At the same time, he had to balance all the demands from various groups for more assistance. So in that sense, greatly helped by revenue. He was able to give them some support, not too many kind of tough decisions that were going to offend and get everybody alarmed. So I think he would be pretty well pleased with the result.
Andrew, we often talk when it comes to budgets about the story of the budget, what's actually cutting through, leaving an impression on voters. What do they pick up? Now, Labor reckons their focus groups this week after the budget, 2 things have cut through. One is that there's a surplus, and the other is that it's going to be cheaper to see the doctor. Now, they would say that. Do you think that that's probably right? Are those the sorts of things that have cut through?
It's possibly right, because the Medicare boost, the bulk billing boost, was one of the new items, one of the things that was actually a surprise on the night. But I think that the surplus is kind of key to a lot of what happened. I think fundamentally the Treasurer began with this audacious bid to wrest from the Liberals the superior economic management cloak. I think that's his ambition. I think it became, ironically, a bit more complicated when it became clear that the surplus was going to be in rather rude health, because that flint-hearted nature of budgets where you have to try and say no, eventually he had to say yes. And I'm sure he would enjoy getting a question as to whether it was more generous than he planned a few weeks ago, but I suspect it was. I think that he ended up having to open the chequebook a bit wider than he intended only 3-4 weeks ago.
But he's, while doing that, has had to, as you've all mentioned, keep an eye on inflation, not do anything that's going to make the current inflation problem even worse. And he was clearly aware that this was the risk and wanted to knock it on the head right from the get-go, even in the budget speech, that this is not an inflationary budget. Here he was.
The Treasury has been incredibly clear that elements of our cost of living plan will actually take some of the edge off the inflation forecast next year, particularly our energy relief plan. So our budget has been carefully calibrated to address these cost of living pressures in our economy without adding to inflation.
Now, funnily enough, economists can't seem to agree. Shane, some think it is inflationary, some think no, not really. Not many are saying it puts downward pressure on inflation.
No.
What's the truth?
Well, let's go back to last year's budget, to Josh Frydenberg's, okay? And he put in almost $20 billion. He put in $9 billion between the start of April and the end of June, and then the Lamington, the low and middle income tax offset, which was worth another 12 bill. Not many people said this is inflationary. It clearly was. And Treasury at the time was their advice to Josh Frydenberg was this probably not inflationary. We come forward to this point in time where you've got, I think the extra spend in this financial year is $1 billion. And then you have the changes that are coming through, which are worth, depending on who you talk to, whether 12 billion or whether you include the pay rise that's going to the richly deserving people in aged care, whether that's inflationary. It's a smaller figure in total, and yet you've got into this fight. And some of the extra spending is, say, $1.5 billion on submarines. There is no way that's inflationary, for instance. There's extra money for spending on overseas foreign missions. That's not inflationary. So I think the argument that this is pushing inflation up, I don't think you can make it. Whether it reduces inflation is a different story, though.
Well, I guess it comes down to some of the increases in support payments like JobSeeker, and this is where we get to the Liberals' reaction to this. Both, you know, the budget reply from Peter Dutton and the general tone of the week. Jennifer, what do you think the Liberals are trying to say about this budget, and was it backed up in the budget reply from Peter Dutton?
Well, it was backed up in rhetoric. There's nothing, you know, they kept saying there's nothing for the middle class. Of course, some of the bulk billing charges do help, and some of the childcare charges from the last budget clearly help the middle class. But he's trying to emphasise that people who are feeling the squeeze, they're certainly feeling the squeeze of higher interest rates, and just higher inflation generally. There is nothing for them. At the same time, of course, he couldn't afford to actually offer them anything because that would naturally be extremely inflationary.
Take, for example, the low and middle income tax offset. You know, we've heard a lot of complaints from the Liberals that this was discontinued. But if you did extend that for another year, that'd be inflationary, right?
Well, I think this is kind of one of the only kind of good thing about opposition. One of the very bitter things about it is that you can complain and criticise. Labor did a lot of this as well without actually offering too many solutions, and I think that's what you're seeing with the Liberals at the moment.
This was pretty special, though, because this was their policy that they're complaining about. That's taken irony to a new space.
But there is a feeling, you know, he's trying to target people who are saying, look, we're having, you know, trouble meeting our budgets. We're having, you know, our expenses are much greater. What's the budget done for us? And so the Liberals are trying to tap into that just as a criticise Labor without saying much about what they do.
So on the budget reply itself then, look, I don't think it was the place to look for big, bold ideas. Peter Dutton's view is it's still far too early in the term, but he had a couple of targeted measures, a ban on gambling ads during the footy, not necessarily a budget issue, but fair enough, that'll resonate. And the other one on JobSeeker, though, is interesting. He's undecided on the $40 a fortnight increase that the government's proposed. Instead, though, he's suggested job seekers or the unemployed should be able to work an extra 10 hours a fortnight before they lose their job seeker payment. What do you think of that?
Well, look, it's probably not a bad idea, to be quite frank. And the fact that the government reaction was, well, we accept any advice that we think passes muster suggests that, you know, maybe they're thinking about it. In the broad, given that you have got low unemployment, clearly a big bid to try and get people into work, people who have not been in work for a long, long time. So maybe the government will look at it. But in the broad, I think the budget reply failed to paint out who Peter Dutton is. You know, he's this kind of rough chalk line at the moment when it comes to the population, and he needs to use these sort of key moments.
Well, he's probably worse than that if you look at the polling in terms of how people are viewing.
Well, you mean a pencil line instead? But if he is a line drawing, he needs to start filling it out, and I think that we're getting some clues as to who he might be beyond the tough Queensland ex-cop. But he needs to do a
lot of bits in there, though, weren't there? Like nuclear power and, as I say, the gambling stuff. And
the job seeker is interesting because there was some research earlier this year from a think tank called E61. So there's about 560,000 people unemployed, but there's 850,000 on job seeker. And never the twain shall meet. A third of recipients are unemployed, and a quarter of unemployed people are a recipient of job seeker. And their point was the entire job support system is problematic. So we've had the report saying, the Economic Inclusion Committee saying increase the rate. and this is what the government's done, we've got this idea, let's increase ours. But the fact that you've got so many more people on JobSeeker who are either, I think they've found that they're older, they're partially disabled, and they're relatively poor, JobSeeker is being used for something else.
But I think also the fact that this is one of the things that Dutton could talk about. These are liberal values. You know, I think in the end they probably will just go through anyway, but they want to make a point, and I think a kind of a good point, that it's not just about the dole, because that's always going to be a sensitive issue, unemployment benefits. We all have these new names for it now, or, you know,
but there's another
job
way
seeker.
of helping.
Yeah, but there is another way of helping them and encouraging people to also get more work, particularly when there's a time of such low unemployment.
All right, well, time to talk to Treasurer Jim Chalmers to take us there. He was the opposition leader, raising concern about those who he says missed out in the budget.
Most economists have reported that they think the budget will be inflationary, which will mean either interest rates go higher or they stay higher for longer. And I think we should be really concerned for a lot of Australians who I think at the moment are the working poor. Labor's working poor, and these are people who continue to work hard, but they just get less bang for their buck in an inflationary environment.
Jim Chalmers, welcome to the program.
Good morning, David, and happy Mother's Day to all of the mums, but especially Laura, Carol and Barbara.
Well said, well said. Now, what do you think of this line and this concept of a working poor in Australia that we've heard from Peter Dutton? Is that a fair description?
Oh, of course not. This is just the predictable combination of division and dishonesty that Peter Dutton learned at the feet of Tony Abbott and Scott Morrison. You know, this was a budget for middle Australia with help for people doing it the toughest and big investments in the future of our economy at the same time as we were able to put the budget on a much more sustainable footing.
So you don't think there's a working poor in Australia?
Oh, certainly there are people doing it tough, and they are the motivation behind all of our efforts to get wages moving again after a wasted decade of wage stagnation and deliberate suppression by our predecessors. So getting wages moving again, helping people with the costs of early childhood education, payday super, paid parental leave, skills and training, all of these agendas and all of these policies which were in the budget on Tuesday night are about helping all of Australians where we can. There is also, of course, some help for the most vulnerable in our society, and we're proud of that.
Well, just on that, what do you think of Peter Dutton's idea to let those on JobSeeker work an extra 10 hours a fortnight before they lose their payments?
Well, getting more people into work was already a central feature of our economic plan before Peter Dutton started scratching around for something to say in Budget Week. You know, we've got 339,000 jobs created under the life of this Albanese government, not yet 12 months old. And we know we need to do a much better job of hooking people up with the opportunities of a job-creating economy. And that's the motivation which sits behind our efforts, whether it's early childhood education, whether it's skills and training, particularly foundational skills and apprenticeships, whether it's our efforts in communities where there has been intergenerational unemployment. All of this is about making sure that we can get more people into work so that they can earn a decent wage and provide for their loved ones. That was our focus before Budget Week, during Budget Week, and it will be after Budget Week as well, as we move towards the employment white paper that I'll be releasing later in the year.
OK, I understand the things you announced in the budget, but what do you think of that idea from Peter Dutton?
Oh, look, we've already said that these sorts of issues are the sorts of issues that we would ordinarily contemplate in the usual business of government,
you will consider
whether it's the employment white paper or in other ways. What we've said since Peter Dutton came out with this on Thursday night is we've already got a substantial agenda when it comes to workforce participation. We are proud of the low unemployment that we've got in our economy. We are proud of our efforts to get more people into work, and just as importantly, when people are working, to get them to earn more so they can provide for their loved ones. That's been a central feature and a central achievement, frankly, of the first year of this Albanese government.
OK, sorry, I'll just ask one more time though. Will you look at this? Were you already looking at it? How should we interpret the answer here?
We are always looking for ways to make it easier for people to participate in work. We were doing that before Peter Dutton was scratching around for this idea.
This idea for job seekers, you were looking at this already?
We're looking at the workforce more broadly in the context of the employment white paper and all of the policies that we've already put in place so that people can work more and earn more and provide for their loved ones.
I want to ask you about housing. Many would agree there's a crisis when it comes to housing in Australia at the moment. Now, your budget does say migration will increase by 1.5 million over the next 5 years. Your Housing Affordability Future Fund aims to build an extra 30,000 homes over that same period. Is it going to be enough?
Well, it's not the only policy that we've got for housing, but it's an important part of it. It's time to end the political games and the ambit claims in the Senate and get this key piece of legislation passed. You know, Labor and a number of the crossbenchers are trying to build more social and affordable homes in our communities, and some parties, the Liberals and the Greens, are saying that they will vote to prevent that. You know, we need to make sure that we put in place this key part of our policy, but in addition to that, we've got new tax breaks for build-to-rent properties to build more affordable rental properties. We've got an increase in Commonwealth rent assistance, the biggest for 30 years. We've got changes to NIFIC. We've got an agreement to extend the $1.6 billion housing and homelessness agreement with the states. We've got a whole range of elements of a really comprehensive package for housing. It's time to get the Housing Australia Future Fund passed through the Senate so we can build more social and affordable homes.
So when you put together that whole range of package, that all the items you mentioned, the various programs, what will that mean for the housing stock over the next 5 years? Do you have any sort of number?
Well, each element of the policies have got different numbers associated with it. You mentioned the 30,000 associated with the Housing Australia Future Fund, the Housing Accord that I've worked up with the states and territories, the investors and the industry is about 1 million homes between next year and 2029. So each of the policies have got different numbers associated with them, but they're all designed in one way or another to deal with the main issue in the housing sector, which is supply. We don't have enough homes, and so whether it's the build-to-rent tax breaks, the Housing Australia Future Fund, or the Housing Accord or some of these other measures, it recognises that if we're going to make housing more affordable, we need more supply. We're trying to do that in the Senate. It's time for the Senate to end its political games and get on board. You
mentioned the National Housing and Homelessness Agreement with the states. That's $1.6 billion from the Commonwealth for social and affordable housing. One of the Greens' demands is that you double that funding for the states in return for them freezing rents for 2 years. Is that a good idea?
Well, first of all, your question's right to acknowledge that rent freezes and those sorts of policies are essentially a matter for the states and territories. But Anthony Albanese, to his credit, has shown leadership at the national cabinet level to see how we can work with the states and territories on issues like renters' rights, and that's really important. When it comes to the agreement with the states and territories, we will do what we can. You know, obviously we have made housing and homelessness a huge priority of our first year in government. That's why I could rattle off that long list of housing policies.
So will you double the funding, as the Greens suggest, under this agreement with the states?
Obviously not going to preempt the conversations that we have with the states and territories or to nominate a number today. We've indicated that we will be extending it. We'll work in the usual collaborative and cooperative way with the states and territories to get a good outcome here. But again, that's not the only element of our housing policy. There are a range of others that I've run through.
But you're willing to go above the $1.6 billion?
Well, it wouldn't be the best negotiating tactic, David, to nominate a number today, but we've said we're prepared to extend it. Julie Collins is doing a magnificent job working with her state and territory counterparts. She got them together, I think, in the course of the last week or two. This is absolutely central to our agenda, and the funding will reflect that.
And when it comes to rent freezes, I mean, yes, it is the states that would have to do it, but what's your view in principle? Do you think it's a good idea at the moment, you know, for a short period of time, or do you worry about landlords and the impact on them?
Oh, it's more a sense of we've got other things that we can do at the national level, and they've been my focus. You know, I haven't been especially focused on that element of it because it's a state and territory responsibility, and because the Prime Minister and the Housing Minister have carriage of that, and they've been interacting with National Cabinet on it.
You're the Treasurer. You don't have any thoughts on whether a rent freeze is a good or a bad idea for the economy?
Well, my thoughts are we're better off trying to encourage supply, and while we do that, we're better to try and take some of the edge off these rental pressures that people are feeling, and that's why I funded on Tuesday night the biggest increase in Commonwealth rent assistance in 3 decades.
Let me turn to the biggest savings measure in your budget, curbing the growth of the NDIS. The Prime Minister said this week, when it comes to how this government governs, one of the defining features is how you go about reform. You get a report, he said, then you respond. You get a report, then you respond. How have you gone about finding this huge $74 billion NDIS saving?
Well, a couple of things about that, David. I mean, the 2 fastest growing areas of government spending are the NDIS and the interest costs on debt, and we made progress on both of those in the budget. But our overwhelming priority when it comes to the NDIS is to make sure that people who the scheme was designed to serve get the right services and programs to help them. I mean, that is our #1 priority, daylight second. And then in order to do that, we need to make sure that we moderate some of the growth in costs. And so what we've been able to do, and I acknowledge the work of Bill Shorten and Anthony Albanese working with the states and territories to do this, is to try and moderate the costs. It's still a demand-driven program. It still will be growing very quick, the quickest growing in the budget. But we need to moderate some of these costs. So in the near term, that's about cracking down on fraud and money going where it's not supposed to be going. We also need to be making sure that we are moderating costs in growth in costs in services and equipment, for example. There is a review underway. There's lots of engagement with the reviewers and with the sector and with the people that the scheme was designed to serve. And that work will be ongoing. The 8% cap in the budget...
Sorry, I'm just going to come to the question, though, which was, how did you arrive at this number? The $74 billion over a decade is huge.
Yeah. Well, the first 15 of that is a consequence of our efforts to rein in fraud and wasteful spending in the scheme. That's at the front end. The 8% target that I was about to refer to kicks in from 2026, and that is the best balance of recognising that the scheme needs to grow. We're not talking about winding back growth in the scheme. We're talking about moderating it at 8% rather than at a number a bit higher than that. And that reflects the best balance and our best understanding of what we need to do to fund the services that people need and deserve while winding back on areas where that spending has been unnecessary or wasteful.
Okay,
Again,
but where did the number come
here,
from, Treasurer? Was it, where's this number come from? Did the Expenditure Review Committee have a good look at this number?
Well, obviously we come to these sorts of decisions based on the advice of the agencies and working closely with the sector and others.
What about Treasury? Did Treasury have a look at this number?
Of course.
So they've modelled this and they're comfortable that you can save $74 billion?
Well, obviously, otherwise it wouldn't be in the budget, David. You know, this is a lot of collaboration. Treasury, Finance, the NDIA, the Minister, the Expenditure Review Committee, more broadly. And what it recognises is it's a demand-driven program. The cost will continue to grow. There are ways that we can moderate that cost in a collaborative way, and that's what we intend to do.
Can you put the detail out for the sector, the disability sector, to have a look at?
Well, there's obviously already a bunch of detail out there. We've put numbers against what we are proposing to do. There's, as you say, there's an ongoing review in addition to that. And the 8% target doesn't kick in until 2026.
No, but
so
you
there'll be a lot
banked
of
the
work.
saving, and all I've seen is a one-page document. Is there more that you could release so that the sector can see where you plan to make these big savings?
Well, obviously, in the course of working with the sector and working with the agency, and working more broadly across government in the context of the review and in the context of the work that happens between now and 2026 when the target comes into place, there will be a lot of information that people can interact with.
Let me ask you about tax. Over the next decade, the budget suggests the structural deficit will actually tighten up and almost close over the next 10 years. A lot of that's because of higher tax receipts, bracket creep in other words. Are you expecting workers to pay more tax to fund the sort of services, defence spending and so on that's going to be required?
Well, first of all, we're really pleased with the progress we've been able to make on the structural position in the budget, but the work isn't finished there. You know, we made a heap of progress showing restraint in the near term, but also finding almost $18 billion in savings and reprioritisations, plus some modest but meaningful tax reform. And the fruits of all of that is a structural position which is better than what we inherited, but there are still structural issues in the budget. And one of the reasons why we saw some of that near-term improvement in the budget is because people are working more and earning more, and that's a good thing.
And paying more tax. And is that the plan over the decade, for people to pay more tax?
Well, our plan over the decade, David, is to strike the best balance between what we need to do to fund the services and programs and investments in the future that people expect of a good government like ours, at the same time as we do modest but meaningful tax reforms like what you saw in the budget, whether it's the PRRT or multinationals or superannuation balances more than $3 million or tax compliance or changes to the tobacco tax. What we've demonstrated is that we can strike the right balance between supporting people in Middle Australia and more broadly at the same time as we make these changes to the tax system to put the budget on a much more sustainable footing.
On the stage 3 tax cuts, I'm sure everybody watching will have heard your line that your position has not changed on the stage 3 tax cuts. You didn't look at it in this budget round.
You picked it, David?
I've heard it once or twice. Yeah. I'm just wondering if you could unpack why. Why has your position not changed? Why was it not a factor in this budget?
Oh, because we had other priorities, David. You know, we wanted to make sure that we could take some of the edge off these cost of living pressures without adding to inflation. We wanted to make sure that we could invest in the foundations of future growth in our economy in areas like the vast industrial opportunities of
just coming back to stage 3,
energy.
though, why does the stage 3 tax cuts need to stay?
Well, as you confidently predicted a moment ago, David, we haven't changed our position.
And I'm asking why.
Yeah, it hasn't been a priority in the context of these budget deliberations because we found other ways to make meaningful changes in the budget to help people through difficult times and invest in their future.
But why are these important? Why do you want to keep them?
Oh, look, we've said in principle that returning bracket creep is a worthy objective of governments of both political persuasions, frankly.
This is returning bracket creep.
We've always said when we can afford to give tax relief, particularly to lower middle income earners, then that's a worthy objective as well. And governments of both persuasions have done that over time. These tax cuts kick in at $45,000. That's a fact which is sometimes lost in the conversation.
Because they get really very little at $45,000. Those on more than 200 grand get the bulk.
Yeah, I understand, David. I understand the structure of the tax cuts. I'm trying to explain to you that when it comes to returning bracket creep, that is a worthy objective. And as you rightly said a moment ago, hasn't been a focus of this budget. They don't come in for more than a year now. And there are other things we want to do in the interim.
Just a final one, Treasurer. According to the budget, the special deal to protect Western Australia's GST share continues to rise. It's billions of dollars every year now. Obviously, Labor won 4 seats in WA. You'd like to hold on to those, I understand it. But is there really any justification for this deal now?
Oh, I think there is, David. I mean, this is in recognition of the really quite remarkable contribution that the people and industries of WA make to our economy nationally and to the national budget as well. And I think it is a good thing that we guarantee a floor of GST revenue out west at the same time as we have said and we have honoured a deal that says none of the other states are worse off as a consequence of that deal.
But it's the only state in surplus now, WA, right? Every other state's struggling in deficit and every state makes a contribution. I mean, Queensland, I'm sure you know, would argue they do a lot with coal exports and tourism. New South Wales, Victoria, they do a lot with tourism and international students and all. Everyone does their bit, right?
Yep. And that's why we've guaranteed that no state is worse off as a consequence of this deal. We've got some other state budgets to come, David. It remains to be seen whether some of them are in surplus as well. But the other states aren't worse off as a consequence of this deal. I think it's entirely reasonable that WA gets the floor that has been agreed.
All right. Treasurer Jim Chalmers, thank you very much for joining us this morning at the end of a very busy budget week. We appreciate it.
Appreciate it, David. Thank you.
All right, back to the panel in a moment. First, here's Hugh Parkinson's unique take on the budget.
We are a nation of lifters, not leaners.
All you're doing is just lifting food from that side of the kitchen and putting it to that side of the kitchen.
Well, this is the one that brings home the bacon.
It's disgusting! Oh. Jim, good morning.
Hey.
Good to see you, buddy. What a quaint little place. How long have you owned it?
It's what we inherited almost a year ago.
And you're in the kitchen, you cook?
Yeah, I do that.
OK, let's find out what's going on, shall we? So, what's on the menu?
Well, this will be a responsible budget for Australians doing it tough.
Wow.
And our priority here is to provide cost of living relief for the most vulnerable Australians.
That's fantastic. I want to see as much as I can. Let's go.
As the staff prepared for dinner service,
That's a small surplus.
Gordon notices Jim's menu has caused confusion in the kitchen.
Oh, me, hold on a minute. Where's that going now?
In Tasmania,
I think this is a really positive announcement.
Wow, that looks like a science experiment.
Don't mess with his art.
As food finally makes its way into the dining room,
Chef Ramsay decides to inspect the cuts.
Oh, God. Jimmy,
Yes.
the cuts are huge, yeah?
Yeah.
That can fill an entire football end zone. Look at the size of it. How long has that been in there?
they were legislated some time ago.
With dinner service coming to an end, Gordon has many concerns.
I don't think we're scrutinising what we're purchasing.
Well, it partly depends on how you spend it, not just the magnitude of the spend, but the quality of the spend. But I invite you to look at the budget in its entirety.
Oh, please. The customers are struggling big time. You're in the service industry. Customer relation. Do you think this is right?
No, I think the divisive commentary is coming from the opposition.
Wow, that was hard. I mean, really hard. He's got everything here to make this place a huge success. I just hope that he's fighting for every customer. Otherwise, what's the point in running a restaurant?
The next day, Gordon wants to make sure that his economics lesson has sunk in.
Holy
The brilliant Hugh Parkinson, there he goes again. Let's just pick up on what we heard from Jim Chalmers just quickly on the Peter Dutton job seeker idea that you let them work longer. Where do you think this is heading, listening to the Treasurer?
Well, listening to Jim Chalmers, they're going to back it in. It's quite clear that they're considering similar policies, but again, it's not entirely silly. It might be a good idea, and that's the way the government's seeing it. What about you, Shane? You reckon it's in the jobs?
Well, the employment white paper's coming later.
Yeah, the employment white paper's coming up. There's last year the government picked up an idea at the Jobs Summit, which was to let aged pensioners earn a little bit more before they lost their pension.
Something Dutton promised in his last.
That's right, and that was picked up. And there was money in the budget to extend that because that was only a trial and it's been extended a year. So I think it's very similar to what this policy is. So you can see the similarities that may lead them to.
Yeah, but I think they will. But they're not going to want to give the Liberals credit for it straight away. So
Probably
I think
not,
it will be
the time later.
sometime.
And your favourite story, Shane, the WA-GST deal. We perhaps explain to people the nature of
how
this
much time have you got,
and as briefly as you can, why the government's sticking with it.
Right. So when this was first proposed by Scott Morrison, it was going to cost $2.3 billion over about a decade.
Okay.
We're now
a lot, but reasonable.
Reasonable, and it's a fair complaint from Western Australians that they are just getting so little of the GST share that's raised in their state. We get to this week's budget. The cost is now at $30 billion.
Now, why is that? Because
the price of iron ore has gone up.
Surprised everybody.
Yeah, it was always assumed it was come down. There was some bright economics writer at the West Australian at the time who said, what happens if iron ore prices go up? They did, and the cost is $30 billion. Now, it was really interesting, that point then from Jim Chalmers saying, oh, our commitment is that no state's worse off. That commitment holds until 26, 27. After that, all bets are off.
Oh, no, excuse me, all bets are not off.
They're not off.
But they're not off because no Labor government will, having won those seats in WA, is going to kind of change that. And of course, New South Wales and Victoria will complain, but that's...
This is it, though. It'll hit Tassie the worst. It'll hit the NT even harder. SA gets hit, then New South Wales, Queensland, and Victoria all end up with less money.
Well, but the fact that iron ore prices have gone up so much and are still staying high is also gives the federal government a lot more money to play with.
That's true.
So it's not just a...
But the deal in and of itself, no state's worse off. The federal budget is worse.
So the Sydney Opera House, the cost of it blew out by 14-fold. This has gone up by 13-fold since it was announced.
I don't think you're going to get any traction in WA with that argument.
All right, let's talk about housing. I touched on it there, whether the government will go further, because they're locked in this pretty tense negotiation with the Greens right now over the Housing Affordability Future Fund. I know there's a lot of funds and programs when it comes to housing, but this is the government's idea that that Anthony Albanese talked about, I think for years before the election. $10 billion fund, invested, the proceeds can then have a revenue stream to build housing each year, 30,000 over 5 years. The Greens want a lot more. They want $5 billion spent every year. And the Labor Senate leader, Penny Wong, there was a pretty fiery moment in the Senate on Thursday, I think it was, between her and the Greens.
This man's ego matters more than women fleeing domestic violence. What sort of party are you? Senator Kim, Senator Wong, what sort of party are you? Wong.
She's not only wrong, she is very clearly showing that Mr Chandler Mather is right under the skin of the government.
That's Max Chandler Mather, who's in the lower house. He's talking about there. He's the housing spokesman for the Greens. He's been, his speeches have been just going viral on TikTok about the rental crisis, the housing crisis and so on. Where's this at behind the scenes? Do you see the government giving an inch to the Greens?
I think they'll give something, but I think it's in the context of the broader debate between the feds, the states and the territories. There's a lot of movement happening. There's a lot of pressure, and the pressure caused by the fact that there's a lot of differentiation between, for example, how rent is treated, and it's treated very differently according to states and territories. Whatever is happening inside National Cabinet will be, the Greens will attribute to their pressure. But you just hinted at something that's we don't properly understand, and that is the subterranean campaign that's being run by the Greens. I'm not particularly active on social media. In fact, I've got out of social media because it's such a putrid place in many parts. But that's the pressure that the government has to be.
Yeah. So this one of the Max Chandler Mather speeches in Parliament has had more than 1 million views on TikTok, apparently, and this dwarfs anything, any government politician's been able to do since the election. So it's getting traction with young people in particular, this, and you can see why, talking about, the rental crisis, the need for more to be done. But my understanding is the Prime Minister's not of a mind to give an inch to them on this. There's talk of, put it up for a vote, it goes down. That happens twice, they have a trigger for a double dissolution. Not they're about to go to an early election, but he's not willing to give them anything on this.
That said, there is some movement. They're talking about how there will be a minimum amount of homes and houses that will be built a year.
Yeah, but we're still talking about at the edges. I mean, housing and immigration, and that's what the Liberals chose for very good reason. This is absolutely explosive out there because people do, whether they're renters, the fact is we are not building nearly enough houses. You notice Jim Chalmers said, oh, well, 1 million houses, affordable houses over 5 years. Well, at the moment, we are nowhere near that. And what we are talking about with the HAP, despite all the political attention on it, is 30,000. And at the same time, we are having this huge increase of 700,000 people overseas net migration in this year, financial year, and next financial year. A lot of that is to do with the fact that we don't have housing supply is actually the states and councils. It's not the federal government. But to suggest that there's any kind of quick fix on this and it'll be solved by the HAF is ridiculous. Yeah. This has been a long time building. It's certainly not like one government, but it's all coming to a head now. And I just don't think this is going to go away as a super hot issue. And as yet, I can't see any solution coming out of either National Cabinet or the federal government.
I mean, the government's right to point out that the migration trajectory pre-COVID would have had us, heading in the same direction anyway. But that doesn't fix the problem now. The Treasurer did leave open, didn't he, going further in this housing accord with the states than the $1.6 billion.
Well, the housing accord is actually with private industry. This is the housing and homeless agreement that they have with the states. Yeah. And this is and Jennifer's absolutely right. All sides of politics, including the Greens, because a rent freeze for 2 years would cause a lot of damage in terms of supply. And at the end of the day, everybody knows supply has to come on somewhere along the line. In the speech by Peter Dutton last week was, let's let people tap super for $50,000. We have been allowing people we've been giving them handouts for 20 years, and we just give them money and it just pushes up the price of housing. So thanks for coming in that space. Yeah. And the federal, and Jennifer's right, 30,000, you were right at and it's targeted in some spaces, but it doesn't mean how you're going to pick up this 1 million or 200,000. You need about 200,000 new homes, apartments and houses and everything else a year.
And also that by that $1.6 billion that they give to the states, the practice of the states has been over many years again to just get more money from the federal government and reduce their own money.
Yeah.
Reduce.
The NDIS saving, I wanted to talk about this because it is, didn't really spot it on budget night. It was the next morning that we sort of put all the numbers together, Andrew. we saw
page 198 of budget paper number 2.
Yeah, and anyway, you and I went scurrying off to talk to Bill Shorten about it to try and unpack how they're doing this. Look, there are various components that you can see would raise or would save some money. I mean, he talks here, the Minister, talking to you, Andrew. One of the components he refers to parents of kids with, what does he call it, developmental delays going on to the NDIS.
Do I blame a parent, a mama bear parent, whose beautiful 2-year-old or 3-year-old seems to have a developmental delay, and the psychologist said, let's get you onto the NDIS, when it's the only lifeboat in the ocean? The fact of the matter is this scheme was never designed for every Australian with a disability, but for the most severely and profoundly impaired.
Now, yes, they can save money on fraud and unethical behaviour, better managing plans, but this bit gets to the sensitive bit. What's he talking about there?
Well, he's talking about the E word, isn't he? It's eligibility. Now, in a broader political sense, the government is contesting this notion that some people will be booted off the NDIS, but this is about eligibility for disability services under the National Disability Insurance Scheme. Now, if you just consider that for a tick, it's not to deny people those services, but who pays for it and under what scheme.
And Jim Chalmers referred a couple of times in the interview to the NDIS being for the people for whom it was designed.
Designed for, and Bill Shorten just told you who he believes it was designed for, and that is the people who are severely impaired or disabled. Now, if that's the case, then that is a massive restructure of the NDIS, because what has happened over the last few years is that effectively states and territories have vacated the field. That whereas you might have a coordinated treatment of someone who...
That's not NDIS, but some other service. But is there any sign of the states...
The states are not going to be rushing back into this. I mean, the way the whole scheme was set up originally by Labor allowed the states this out, and they have taken it. With the result is now that you've got 10% of 5 to 7-year-old boys are on the NDIS, which of course was never the design. But I don't think it was the design, and I think most people reasonably would say that's not what we thought of the NDIS. But Labor in opposition, any attempt to kind of rein that back in was met with, terrible criticism from the Labor Party about how shocking and unfair this was. So they're now having to be very careful. But what they're saying about the savings is this is our ambition, and somehow this will convince the states to take up more of the money. It is an ambition. I can't see from what they've said so far they're going to be anywhere near that. What they're talking about with fraud or over-servicing, hundreds of millions, maybe the low billions, maybe, but I think this is a policy idea. It's got, and that's also one of the reasons why they can say the deficit is coming down over time. But so far, there is no plan to actually kind of develop this, and it's going to be a very, very sensitive thing, which is why they're not even talking about really eligible. They're not really wanting to say eligibility yet because they know the reaction.
So, I mean, there have been briefings this week, and as you referred to, there was one page from a report that's clearly at least more than 23 pages, because that was page 23.
And apparently Treasury's had a good look at this.
Yeah, and have a look. Now, so where are these numbers from? That $15.4 billion over the next 4 years is from the actuary of the National Disability Insurance Agency, which administers the... I mean, you've got fine things to say about the NDIA. Well, coming up. But the money it comes from, say, more staff to monitor plans because there's a lot of waste, 3 to 5 year plans instead of 6 to 12 months, renegotiating the agreement with the states, that's a biggie, using the Commonwealth as a central buyer of equipment. That at the moment, if you need a wheelchair, you buy it on retail.
They'll have to do all of that. Look, we need to leave the budget and move on because on the China relationship, the trade relationship anyway, things are clearly improving. We've just seen Don Farrell return from a couple of days in Beijing. No immediate announcements on lifting the sanctions on beef and barley and wine and so on, but you would expect in the coming weeks we might see something. While he was there, though, the Trade Minister visited a shop that sells international produce, including Australian stuff. And look, you know, he clearly is a natural salesman.
Teach me not a thing, can only get better.
It's beautiful. This is what my wife absolutely loves. This is actually my favourite Penfold product. It's not as expensive as Grange, of course, but it's a lovely, lovely wine. We'd love to see a lot more Australian beef on the Chinese consumer's kitchen table, rather than this American product. Before I go into question time, I go down to Aussie's in Parliament House and I buy a bottle of Bundaberg ginger beer, and it keeps me going for the rest of the afternoon, so it's a wonderful product.
Tell you what, shopping with Don Farrell.
Give that guy a megaphone, yeah?
Coles and Woolies are not going to be lining up to have Don as their new face.
Look, hopefully we get the trade sanctions lifted, but otherwise we'll have Don Farrell out there selling the Aussie produce. Hey, another one just to mention too, in the lead up to budgets, journos are always pretty competitive about getting the budget scoop. You know who got it this year was actually Mike Bowers, when his phone went off while the Prime Minister was addressing the Labor caucus.
She started in 2022 in running for a seat that had previously had Bowers always won. Lucky it was a decent song. Paint it black too soon.
He did paint it black the next day, as it turns out, with that first surplus in 15 years being produced. All right, our panel, Shane Wright, Jennifer Hewett and Andrew Probyn, will be back shortly with some final observations. Time now for Mike Bowers and Talking Pictures.
I'm Mike Bowers and I'm photographer at large for The Guardian Australia. I'm talking all things post-budget with the one and only David Pope, who cartoons for the Canberra Times and ACM, and a very warm welcome to this very chilly post-budget morning.
G'day, Mike. It's actually a really nice morning today.
It is. It's a lovely Canberra crisp winter morning. There's a whole sort of absurd theatre that goes with the budget, that both sides have their sort of different flavours that they like to give to it. And Jim likes to run, and boy does he like to run. We expected him, after he came to Parliament, go in, and he took off and ran 25k.
It's a foggy morning. Did you see it, or did he just sort of disappear into the fog?
I didn't run with him, David.
Oh,
no.
Okay.
Some of the other theatre is the budget being printed, and then usually the Treasury has some form of picture facility, as we call it, PICFAC, and the clouds parted and out came the sun in a little spotlight. It was like, you know, kissed on the butt by a unicorn. And then there's the delivery, and I think that Jim Chalmers' children, Annabelle and Leo, spoke for us all, really, David.
You sat there waiting for the big yawn. That's no doubt going to come for a poor little kid who has to sit up through a budget speech.
Don Farrell here, I think, looks fairly
seeking guidance from a higher power.
And of course, the budget tree is used to great effect nowadays.
Yeah. Well, why wouldn't you? It's magnificent.
It's a magnificent thing. It's just a lovely backdrop. And then the budget moves on to the Great Hall of Parliament House, where the National Press Club Budget Plus One address happens. Just run us through your artwork here. You've got the Treasurer in a straitjacket of Scott Morrison's creation.
It's Dr. Jim's relief, repair and restraint.
Yeah, right.
Which was the theme he brought coming into the budget.
Yeah.
And the centrepiece for this government was Medicare.
He's in a Scott Morrison straitjacket, being tightened by the Prime Minister because they're the stage 3 tax cut, and then he's tiptoeing with his tap dancing with his feet.
That's right. I'm trying to include the constraints that they've set themselves and that they've inherited, and then the measures that they're introducing, which are pretty modest.
I did love this Brolman, not my king, not my surplus.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah,
it's a nice, simple, powerful statement about, surpluses and whether there's something to be trumpeted or not.
Great Mark Knight. He's got the Reserve Bank governor here.
Oi, quit that. With budget relief.
Just a little drop of budget relief there. Yeah, tough love only as a kicker. Right. Fiona Katauskas seems to think that the petroleum resources rent tax is going to hurt the earth more than it hurts you. This is going to hurt her more than it hurts you.
It's Jim with the very modest PRRT changes and the burning earth. Gas and petroleum seem pretty happy there.
Yeah.
They can live with that.
They can live with that.
Can we? We'll see.
On Thursday, we got the opposition's budget in reply, and Scott Morrison went and saw Treasurer Dutton. What do you reckon he said? Sorry for leaving your husband such a mess. He sort of, the one bit of emotion, he went over and gave his wife a bit of a hug, and that was it. It was fairly low-key. Kathy Wilcox has sort of captured the zeitgeist. It should have been ours.
Wow.
Budget, stronger economy, fairer society.
Budget, cost of living relief.
Budget, first surplus in 15 years, and Angus Taylor here.
Totally not fair.
David, it's been a pleasure unpicking the very busy budget week, and I'll let you do the honours.
It's great to talk to you, Mike. Back to you, David.
Thank you, David, and thank you, Mike. Let's get some final observations. Andrew, you first.
Well, first of all, happy Mother's Day to Felicity, my mum Meg, and my mother-in-law Jill, who had a big birthday in recent days. As for my observation, it looks like the Pharmacy Guild has not given up the fight on challenging dispensing rules being doubled to 60 days. They're out in the market. I understand market research trying to find attack lines and proposing an alternative being $19 scripts as opposed to 60-day dispensing rules.
Jennifer.
Well, the Labor government's not just lucky because of the revenue that's flowing in, they're also lucky because the Liberals right across the country are in a frenzy of division and self-destruction, really. And the fact that the one remaining Liberal government has now gone into minority in Tasmania, just as a demonstration of what a long, cold winter it's going to be for the Liberals.
Indeed. Shane.
Happy Mother's Day to my wife Danette, my mum Robyn, and my mother-in-law Norma. Jim Chalmers, everyone focuses on the budget, but he has got a fairly solid 6 months to go for the rest of the year. He's got his Meaning What Matters report coming out in the next month or so, the Employment White Paper, an intergenerational report which has been brought forward, MyEFO. He's still got to reform part of the Productivity Commission, and he's got to bed down the Reserve Bank review. There's a lot going on for the Treasurer.
It's a busy old year. Thank you all very much for joining us this morning. Now, some politicians clearly worked for hours on their budget one-liners this week. Some of the zingers worked, some didn't. We'll leave you with a marvellously mangled metaphor from Jane Hume. Thanks for watching.
I think it was Winston Churchill that said, taxing your way out of a budget crisis is like lifting yourself up by the handle, lifting yourself, standing in a bucket with the handle. Something as articulate as that, I'm sure Winston Churchill said. But
you're making us all feel very excited about being here.